Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight for the IISS again to host this First Sea Lord Conference. We have enjoyed this collaboration and, of course, thank our sponsors for supporting it. Last year, we met just as the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier was departing for the Indo-Pacific, and all the talk was of that region and of the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt. Now we meet when there is a ferocious land war being prosecuted against the biggest country in Europe that has rightly consumed all of our recent attentions. It has also invited an examination of our evolving strategic culture in the West and among its larger military powers. It is interesting to note how the attitude of NATO's leader, the United States, has moved in just some 65 days through 5 phases. At the beginning, the US position was to remind everybody that there was no NATO Article 5 obligation owed to Kyiv, but there wasn't perhaps enough early statements about Kyiv's UN Article 51 right to defend itself and the corresponding UN Article 51 of any nation to respond to that call. Second, there was an assertion that defensive weapons should be transferred, but not offensive weapons. Escalation was a concern, even if one might contend that defense is not escalation. Third, there was a statement that Ukrainians must be supported in this war, and there was a need to assure Russia's strategic failure. Then that Ukraine must win, and finally that Russia must be weakened so that it never threatens its neighbors again, that in 65 days. The European security order, shattered by Russia's invasion, is, to borrow a Chinese phrase, a core interest of the West. It is also the case that the West must be seen as effective co-authors of a Ukrainian victory in its war against Russia, for its Indo-Pacific tilt both to be possible and to be credible. That is because European and Indo-Pacific security are codependent, a fact that some Indo-Pacific powers are now recognizing. The LDP in Japan, in discussing Tokyo's national security strategy, proposed to the Prime Minister last week that Japan move to align to the NATO standard and spend up to 2% of GDP on defense. That was as much a recommendation that flowed from the threat environment change in Europe as it was a signal of growing concerns about China. It would catapult Japan into 3rd place, behind only the United States and China in global defense expenditure, and just ahead of Germany, who would be in 4th place if they too reached 2%, as their chancellor promised. A year ago, we would not have imagined that Japan and Germany might become the 3rd and 4th largest defense spenders in the world. I note that Prime Minister Kishida is now in London and expected to sign new defense agreements today with the UK. Naval power is, of course, integral to both the European and Indo-Pacific theaters, and indeed globally. There is an important maritime component to this war now in deterring and containing wider aggressive action. There are also possibilities in the future that maritime power may be needed to ensure that vital food supplies are deliverable from the Black Sea port of Odessa to their markets, especially in North Africa. A free and open Black Sea is as important as a free and open Indo-Pacific. Against that background, it is a delight that we open this conference with the delivery of the Sir Henry Leach Lecture by the Minister of the Armed Forces, James Heappey. Henry Leach was the first Sea Lord at the time of the Falklands War, whose 40th anniversary we are marking now. We are delighted that his daughter Henrietta Wood is present here with her husband Nicholas on this occasion, and I'm also delighted to recognize the Minister for International Trade, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, whose father was the first Director of Studies at the Institute for Strategic Studies. The British public have come to know James Heappey well from his frequent briefings in the media and from the MOD on British strategy in the war. We're delighted to have him here at this time for this lecture that will be followed by an important statement from the First Sea Lord. Minister, the floor and this podium is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and speak today. I know that there was at least one other who would have been invited in front of me, and he sends his apologies. But that is the role of the deputy, and I am grateful for the opportunity, nonetheless, to come and enthuse about all that a retired soldier has learned about the importance of maritime power projection in my time as the Minister for the Armed Forces. And to be invited to do so as the Sir Henry Leach lecture is a real honour, and particularly to have Sir Henry's daughter in the family, in the room. It would be remiss, I think, not to reflect on the fact that this is the 40th anniversary of the Falklands, and Sir Henry made his name both as a maritime commander during the Cold War, but also in the advice that he gave around the use of maritime power in the Falklands. And so this is a good moment, I think, to reflect to the Falklands generation of veterans that although the news agenda is elsewhere right now, and I think that we would probably have all thought when we were looking at the news grids back in sort of October, November last year, that the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Falklands would be very high profile right now. And it's not. And I don't want anybody in the wider Royal Navy community to think that that is because our thoughts are not with those 85 Royal Navy personnel, 26 Royal Marines and 18 Royal Fleet Auxiliary personnel who gave their lives in that conflict. It is an act of great sacrifice. And I think, where there is the parallel is that 40 years ago, the British public knew that the right thing to do was to sail an awfully long way and stand up for the rights and the freedom of the Falkland Islanders and to accept all of the risks that that brought with it. And what we've seen over the last 3 months is that the British public are every bit as resolved to do the right thing, no matter what the risks may be to the United Kingdom. And so whilst the conversation is dominated by Ukraine, I just wanted to open this lecture by making sure that everybody in the Royal Navy community and the Royal Marines community knows that absolutely nobody in Her Majesty's government has forgotten that this is a very important anniversary, and that our thoughts and admiration are with all who fought so valiantly on the sea and from the sea in that conflict. Now, the other thing that I think Sir Henry would appreciate about the world in which we live today is that we have returned to a period of systemic competition. Now, the IR foresaw that, and the IR started to re-gear the British Armed Forces to be a set of armed forces that could persistently be present in parts of the world where we were challenged and to compete. But when it was in the IR, it was just words, it was just policy. What's happened over the last year, and particularly in the last 3 months, has brought that into very sharp focus. But I think what's interesting is when you stop and think about it, in the maritime domain, everything has changed, but yet nothing has changed. The UK's geography hasn't changed. We still sit from the Russian perspective of the left-hand gatepost of their route into the North Atlantic. The Greenland, Iceland, UK gap hasn't changed in its strategic importance. It is still hugely important that you have the ability to protect your fisheries and your oil and gas assets at sea, both in home waters and in the waters of overseas territories, in the waters of allies and partners. And of course, it's hugely important that you can protect and defend your trade routes. Although a big difference since the end of the Cold War is that the offshoring of manufacturing and the globalization of supply chains has meant that those sea lines of communication are now even more important to Western economies than they were 30 or 40 years or so ago. So no change in that sense. Geography hasn't changed. The resources of the ocean and of our seas and our requirement to protect them hasn't changed. And sea lines of communication for the purposes of trade, no change. But what has changed is the existence of undersea infrastructure and the threat that can be posed against that, that is material to our national security and the existence of our liberalized global economy. 97% and rising of global data travels in cables under the seas, and trade worth $10 trillion per day. So too, is there a renewed challenge to the rules-based international system, and with that, the governance and protection of rights on the global commons. And that is not just about how we do our business on the high seas, but so too, and this was brought into very sharp focus when I was in the office of the commander of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, where he was showing me the 3 pinch points in his patch at Suez, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Straits of Hormuz. And you realize that it doesn't take much in the way of maritime power, or even, you don't even need a navy, missile power, in order to hold at risk an entire global order at certain points of geography around the world. And the other thing that has really changed is the geopolitics of some of the key seas in our near abroad. During the Cold War, the Black Sea had just Turkey as a NATO member, and then Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, Georgia as part of the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union. Now it's the complete inverse. Romania, Bulgaria have joined Turkey. Georgia is a NATO aspirant. Ukraine remains, we think, a NATO aspirant. We'll see how the chips fall. Also, Russia stands alone in the Black Sea, where previously it was the opposite way around for NATO. Exactly the same, I think, with the geopolitics of the Baltic. In the Cold War, the Baltic was West Germany, Denmark, and Norway in NATO, Sweden and Finland non-aligned. But then the Soviet Union in St. Petersburg and in Kaliningrad, and then Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and East Germany around the rest of the coast. Completely inverted if, as looks likely, Finland and Sweden decide to make a bid to join NATO. All of a sudden in the Baltic, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad stand alone around a coastline that would otherwise be NATO. That's a massive geopolitical shift in 2 really important European seas. Then there is the change of climate, and with that, the opening up of a sea route in the high north, and how we will stand up for a rules-based international system and freedom of navigation rights between east and west across Russia's northern coast. So our interest in the maritime remains enormous, self-evidently so. And as an island nation with global ambition, how could it be anything but? But our competition in our near abroad, through NATO, in reacting to changing geopolitics and a changing security situation in the Euro-Atlantic, is a great challenge for the Navy, for the fleet commander, and Charlie Stickland, Chief Joint Operations, is here as well. How does NATO reassure its allies in seas that are now predominantly NATO coastlines, but where a belligerent Russia will seek to challenge? That requires naval resource, it requires presence. That's a resource and a presence that can be internationalized, but it requires a clear commitment from us to be there and to stand up for the rights of our NATO partners in those seas. So too, however, must we not be fixed? I liken it to watching my son play under-10s football, where the style is very much to chase the ball. All 20 players on the pitch are within about 10 yards of the ball at any one time. And there's a danger that, just as last year, on the eve of HMS Queen Elizabeth and her strike group sailing, all of the conversation was about the Indo-Pacific tilt and the opportunities there. There's a danger that this year, we focus exclusively on sub-hunting in the North Atlantic, standing up for our neighbor, for our allies and partners in the Baltic and the Black Sea, competing in the Mediterranean, and that everything reverts to being about the Euro-Atlantic. But that would be a massive mistake, because we have an obligation as a global trading nation, and just because of the nature of modern competition between states, to also compete for influence, prosperity, and to protect our friendships in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and the Caribbean. And I just, it was fortuitous that she was in the right place at the right time. But in the South Pacific, take that as an example, as far away from the UK as you can get, but where the UK through the Commonwealth has partnerships and friendships that have lasted decades, but that we have been failing to meaningfully service for decades as well. In fact, we've been relying, I would argue, entirely on the Australians and New Zealanders to carry on flying the flag for the Commonwealth with countries in the South Pacific. Well, how fantastic that literally months after the offshore patrol vessels arrive in the Indo-Pacific, we have exactly the sort of moment where the danger was that China would be the first to arrive in Tonga with aid, and China becomes the person who helped Tonga in their hour of need. But instead, a Royal Navy offshore patrol vessel was 2 days sail away because she was forward present, ready to react, whatever the situation was. And she was there alongside the Australians and the New Zealanders, reacting to that moment of opportunity. I just thought that was the most brilliant vindication of why we do forward presence, why we need to operate, why we need to be constantly recognizing that we are in a competition. And that point of competition changes all the time, from the humanitarian to the opportunity to develop capability together and to share aligned inventories and ways of operating, all the way through to the more hard-edged competition that is the business of naval power. Now, I think the case for naval power is clear. Obviously, I eulogized already about the threats from the sea and our opportunities around the world. But the challenge is what sort and how much of it. Now, I was warned passionately, strongly by every sailor I've spoken to, do not read anything into the Moskva, because they will start telling you about the position that the radars were in at the time that it was hit, and that therefore crew error. So I won't. I also phoned up Ben yesterday morning, and alongside that warning, I said, yeah, but why is everything constantly bigger? Why is a destroyer now the size of a cruiser? Why is a frigate now the size of a destroyer? Why is the answer to everything in the naval world, what you need, Minister, is bigger and more expensive? There followed Naval Architecture 101 around height of mast, beam, and therefore length and tonnage. So I sort of get that these things are more complicated than a simple former soldier might have initially thought. But I do think there are some realities that we would be failing ourselves if we weren't to challenge ourselves over. Missile technology on land and at sea appears to be ascendant. Industrial base, particularly in the UK, but actually you could argue across the West, compared to China particularly, our industrial base is limited. And supply chains are increasingly challenging and raw materials increasingly expensive. So in those circumstances, surely there is a conversation to be had about a more disruptive approach to maritime power projection. Is the answer really ever bigger ships, ever bigger submarines? Now, for what it's worth, this isn't me saying that we've made mistakes or the things we're buying are not right. I think the UK's current fleet and our planned acquisitions over the next decade or two are right. I think that the Carrier Strike Group deployment was a huge success and proof that projection of air power from the maritime remains a hugely persuasive hard tool power that can be projected anywhere in the world. And when you get to that amazing Elysium field of interoperability with your key allies, as we proved in the Mediterranean and in the Philippine Sea, then it can be a really, really persuasive reminder of those who seek to challenge the rules-based international system, just how much power can be brought quickly to bear against them on a sovereign piece of territory that can self-propel anywhere in the world. But I'm interested in how we put alongside that Carrier Strike Group vision and these amazing destroyers and frigates that we will buy over the next decades, a dispensable, dispersible, autonomous capability that makes the challenge for our adversaries even harder, that poses them with real dilemmas. I also want to see the Royal Navy lead the way in lethality. I thought that Andrew's predecessor, Jerry Kidd, in his haul-down letter, that is the right term when you lead, is it? Yeah, in his haul-down letter, wrote some really persuasive things about the importance of lethality. And I think it was quite interesting that when the US and the UK have sent ships into the Barents Sea. It is the American DDGs that attract attention because of their lethality and their ability to project power from the maritime to the land domain. Now, our frigates clearly have an important role in protecting those destroyers, so our presence was very necessary. But pricklier, more lethal naval platforms that pose your adversaries challenge at sea and from the sea to land, I think are conversations we need to be having ourselves and challenging ourselves to get right. I also think that we need to rediscover, and all these people with beards who spend their life beneath the ocean or deep in bunkers at Northwood are effusive about this, but we've got to listen to them, that the submarine domain is less well understood than space. And we have to invest in the advantage that you can find beneath the oceans, because I continue to believe that it is a place from which you can do all manner of stuff in a way that your adversaries don't get a say in whatsoever. But it's how we operate too. And I think that, our competition for relationships, for inventory with partners around the Gulf of Guinea, along the East African coast, in the Caribbean, in the Arabian Gulf, and in the South Pacific, are opportunities to compete to maintain the UK sphere of influence and to push back against a growing Chinese influence, particularly in many parts of the world, but actually Russia is active in many parts of the world too, with similar ambitions. And that doesn't mean that we are there as a guarantor of their security. It is that we engage them as partners, as equals, without creating debt dependency, without demanding basing rights in return. The deal that we do is that we have a set of values that we espouse, and we have a willingness to have a relationship as equals that, in my experience, when I have seen Royal Navy training teams around the world doing this with our partners in the Commonwealth and beyond, our people just instinctively get, and when they do it, it is brilliant, it is powerful, it is wonderful, and it stands in stark contrast to the way that the Chinese do their business with checkbook and stick. And we mustn't be dismissive. There's a tendency, because we did the carrier strike group and it went so well with the Charles de Gaulle and with the Reagan, to say, well, that's it now. We are a first tier carrier navy and that's what matters. Of course we are. But there are a network of patrol boat navies with security challenges in the maritime domain of their own in seas around the world where the white ensign has a place and where British naval expertise is a currency that is hugely admired and where there's an appetite to partner. So I'm every bit as excited about HMS Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales as I am HMSs Spey, Tamar, Medway, Forth, and Trent. There we go. Sorry, HMS Trent. And there will be a moment, where those switch to be the Type 31s. But I hope that they don't switch completely, because in some parts of the world, Type 31 is too big. It's over-roaring. When you turn up, you're not being a partner, you're being the boss. And so I hope that the Navy strikes a balance between putting Type 31 out in replacement to the batch 2 OPVs, but also in addition to the batch 2 OPVs, so the right platform with the right profile is in the right place, flying the flag for the UK. And for what it's worth, since the Secretary of State wasn't available and the speech is mine, the thing that I'm really interested in is for those patrol boat navies, given the role that we have that is non-discretionary in home waters, how do we, the Royal Navy here in the UK, use a set of smaller, simply maintained, highly exportable patrol vessels in our home waters that then have the RN seal of approval, for which the export market and the Secretary of State for International Trade nods enthusiastically. There are dozens of navies in the market to buy that sort of platform, and it would be great if we could operate it in home waters too. But as the First Sea Lord said yesterday, all great, Minister, but it's going to cost you. But it's a conversation we need to have. Ladies and gentlemen, over the last 18 months or so, I have had the huge pleasure of seeing the Royal Navy deployed on its Littoral Response Group experimentation deployment into the Mediterranean. I have had the pleasure of sitting in the ops room of a Type 45 destroyer, where they have shown me the air picture that they saw as they sailed across the bottom of Crimea. I have stood on offshore patrol vessels in Curacao, Cartagena, and Dakar. I have stood on minesweepers in Bahrain. I have been on a submarine on the first day of fresh air after its deployment with our continuous at-sea deterrent. I've been in bunkers being briefed on the incredible spooky stuff that our SSNs do day in, day out. I have been briefed by frigate and destroyer crews that have been in the High North and the Black Sea and the Baltic and the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy is operating the world over with huge success. It is magnificently busy. It is ready to fight. The maritime contribution to our national security right now is inescapably important. And I am so proud of the work that our men and women who wear dark blue for work are doing. I want them to be busier yet. I want them to continue to be Europe's foremost navy with a warfighting capability that makes our adversaries take note. But so too, do I want to see the white ensign flying in all corners of the world as partners to nations big and small, reminding them that in the UK, they have a real friend, and from the sea, we do things best. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. I don't think the First Sea Lord could have hoped for more enthusiasm or greater command of the detail. First Sea Lord, the podium is now yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, guests, those here present and also online, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Sea Power Conference at Arundel House, and to you, John, and your team for supporting us and enabling this conference to take place. It's always great, they say, when somebody else makes your argument for you. And two moments of joy and one of trepidation struck me as I listened, Minister, to your fabulous enthusiasm and exposition of the case for the maritime. The first was, you've got it. For a former rifles officer, you can now badge yourself properly maritime. The second was, my speech is going to be a lot shorter, which is good for you. And the third was, which of the paragraphs can I actually scrub out from a carefully constructed script so it doesn't sound repetitious? And we do look as if we tried to join ourselves up across the messages we want to get across today. But I think most importantly, and I really am grateful to you, Minister, what you encapsulated there was two things that a First Sea Lord could not wish for. The first was profound government support for what we are trying to do. An enthusiasm for the maritime that some of my predecessors could only have dreamed of. Through no fault of their own or the government, it was just a fact of the geostrategic times we found ourselves in much of the last 20 years. But also because, as you say, actually so much of what is going on at the moment has not changed. And the facts of a navy, the facts of our nation are exactly the same and will continue to be so. So it gives me a great opportunity now in my first Sea Power conference, perhaps to just come down from the case for, which I think has been unanimously and unquestionably made, into some of the implications for that case and how I, as the First Sea Lord, see my role and obligations over the next few years. And I'm delighted that in being joined to explore some of the very difficult questions that still confront us, and some of which you laid out, Minister, I'm privileged to be joined by some of my fellow chiefs from navies around the world, who are themselves also seeking to confront the same list of challenges. Later today, we'll be joined by Admiral Mike Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations for the United States. And I'm particularly pleased that Amiral Pierre Vendier, my French opposite number, has also come over from Paris to join us because he has his own extraordinarily busy diary. Thank you, Pierre. And I'd also like to welcome, though not in the room, the First Sea Lord Fellows, a number of future maritime strategists. I look forward to what we are going to talk about. And it is also for me a delight to recognize Sir Henry's daughter in the memorial lecture given in your father's name, Henrietta. It's particularly poignant, as the minister said, 40 years on from that moment when Sir Henry found himself standing in front of the Prime Minister with that well-known moment where he just gave her that piece of confidence that this was something we could do. And Sir Henry was part of that group of 4 admirals whose names are carved very much into the Royal Navy's contemporary history: Sir Terry Lewin, Sir John Fieldhouse, and Sir Sandy Woodward. We owe them all an enormous debt for the Navy we are today. Now, back in February, I delivered my call to arms speech to industry in Rosyth, in the massive, modern, forward-facing shipbuilding hall, which from where the Type 31s will be built and from where HMS Venture's keel was laid only the other day. I set out my priorities for the service over the next decade and a half, looking at the important transitions we have to introduce into the surface and submarine flotillas, as so much of the fleet is recapitalized. I described our ambition to embrace modern technologies and also laid out our obligations to protect the planet's climate and characteristics, and the absolute essential need to embrace the diversity of the society we have today. It was intended to be forward-looking, to say that the integrated review recognized a huge and ambitious investment in the Royal Navy by the government. What were we going to do to turn that into delivery? And at the same time, we were maintaining an operational tapestry around the world, so well laid out and described just now. Of course, also at the same time, President Putin was making his final preparations and subsequently has invaded Ukraine. So has the IR changed? Sorry, has Ukraine changed the IR? Do we need to revisit its conclusions? Now, clearly, I'm not going to disagree with the minister's very clearly asserted statement that no. In fact, I think it doubles down on some of those conclusions. We will have to react. We will have to respond to the realities of what we see going on around. We have to recognize that some of our assumptions about Russia are clearly wrong and what they mean. And we also need to be reminded forcefully and impressively about what courageous will of the people, that well-known Staff College center of gravity analysis, what that can do for the defense of a homeland. And we've also seen the brutal and ugly reality of what state-on-state warfare feels like. The damage that we see, the misery on human life laid out in our television screens on a daily basis. We've also seen what light, low signature forces like those that the Ukrainians have been deploying can do and how effective they can be against some of the more traditional armored vehicles and tanks of an army that is not operating, as my colleagues in green tell me, that is not operating with contemporary imagination, that doesn't understand mission command, and it doesn't innately seize opportunity as laid out before it. All of which has left me convinced that the journey that we are on with the commando forces in our world is entirely right, because that means to operate at speed, with agility, with light footprint, to get inside the OODA loop of your opponent is absolutely crucial to success. And there has also been a reminder, just as we were reminded 40 years ago, that in state-on-state warfare, big items of kit and lives can be lost. And the loss of HMS Sheffield almost 40 years ago today was a huge wake-up call for us in the Royal Navy. The first ship to be lost in conflict since the Second World War. But it didn't stop us. It didn't bring us to a grinding halt in our tracks. Indeed, it was set within a context by my predecessor, Sir Henry, as one of the brutal realities of what we are about. And it is a sobering reminder of just how quickly events can change in the maritime in conflict, either through bad luck or through being ill-prepared. So I argue the conclusions of the integrated review remain valid. It concluded there was an increasing risk of return to state-on-state conflict. Risk now equals issue. It foresaw the importance of alliances and partnerships. It reaffirmed the need for us in defense to future-proof by embracing technology innovation. It reiterated the need for a joined-up approach across government if we are to achieve what the national endeavor is. And we have to embrace all of the talent to deal with the problems that face us. A little bit of detail. And luckily for you, because the minister's been so good, I'm now turning over 2 pages of my speech. But I will just one point. When we talk about that return to state-on-state warfare, when we talk about the need to operate at high levels of intense warfare, we know that we're not going to do so alone. And NATO remains, therefore, the key cornerstone of what we are going to do. As signaled in the IR, we have to be ready to defend our homeland. We must be resilient, demonstrating an ability to protect all that matters to us, as was laid out by the minister, some of which is changed very recently. But we are not constrained to the Euro-Atlantic. And I welcome the announcement today by the Prime Minister for closer defense ties with Japan, just as we have made long-standing commitments with our friends and allies in New Zealand and Australia in the Indo-Asia Pacific. We have to have partnerships if we are to stand up to autocratic states. And if we don't, then, as Sir Henry Leach told Mrs. Thatcher in 1982, we will find ourselves living in a very different country whose word counts for little. So alliances and partnerships matter. We mark a century since the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922 by signatories from the United Kingdom, America, France, Japan, and Italy. And it's telling how closely these signatory powers are now today. Once divided by mutual fear and mistrust, we are now united in common endeavor. We are all committed to the free and open global commons. And in the last year, the Royal Navy has exercised and operated with all of them. Another page of my speech gets turned over because the minister's enthusiasm. What he didn't point out, though, leaving me a little bit of space, was that not only was Carrier Strike Group 21 a major deployment, but it was also a useful means by which we operated with our Royal Air Force and British Army colleagues as a convening and enabling activity around the world. There is something about aircraft carriers that recognizes a platform that can flex across the full spectrum of soft to hard power and a statement of national confidence. Queen Elizabeth has flown F-35B fifth generation jets, and Prince of Wales has trialed jet drones. And I'm delighted later this year, we will host the Atlantic Future Forum on board HMS Prince of Wales on the eastern seaboard of the United States. A summit on the carrier will take place shortly after the United Nations General Assembly. And I can think of no better location for us to convene with allies and partners to reaffirm our commitment to the rules-based international order and our steadfast commitment to the North Atlantic Alliance. And I know, John, you and IISS will be participating, and I look forward to seeing many in the audience there. 4 of the 5 Washington Naval Treaty signatories were founded members of the NATO alliance in 1949, which has since grown then to 30 democracies. And the extraordinary summit in Brussels in March, NATO leaders agreed to reset longer-term deterrence and defense posture across all domains in response to Russia's actions. As one of the most capable navies in NATO, we have an obligation to reflect this in our future posture, integrated with those with whom we one day have to fight. And therefore, it is important for me as a First Sea Lord that the closest of dialogues I maintain are those with my international Chiefs of Navy colleagues. That intellectual alignment around what we stand for and what we mean is crucial, because if we mean it in war, we have to invest in it in peace. And we also need to future-proof ourselves, embracing technology and innovation, just as the minister said, and embracing diversity of thought and approach. We have always been a service comfortable with adaptation, from sail to steam, steam to nuclear. And now we are seeing an unprecedented pace of technological change, which we need to keep up with at the very least, or we will be found wanting. We may not no longer go into combat with muskets, and I am part of those who say the death of heavy armor is overplayed. But we still need to consider whether our kit is fit for purpose and ensure we are ready to fight the next war and not the last. We in the Royal Navy are the beneficiaries of the steps put in place by our predecessors and the leadership of the ministerial team. And we see over the coming 15 years a number of significant transitions as we strive to increase our operational advantage. The Type 26, Type 31 and Type 32 frigates, multi-role ocean surveillance capabilities, and in the underwater domain, the remaining Astute-class submarines, and most crucial of all, the Vanguard to Dreadnought transition in maintenance and pursuance of the continuous at sea deterrence. These are huge obligations placed upon our service, and just achieving those transitions will stretch us in a way that we have not seen for a number of decades. This is a proportional level of change in the fleet over the next decade and a half that we have not seen since the end of the Second World War. So it's an exciting prospect and one I welcome. But it's not just about big lumps of metal. It's also having the agility and ability to adapt and change what we do from them. Only last month, I visited Storm Cloud, hosted at Norton Manor Camp by 40 Commando, to see how we're changing the way we trial and procure new tech, from AI, quantum, cloud edge technology to weaponized UXVs, working with the likes of Amazon Web Services and Anduril. We're showing that the old ways don't have to be set. We can pitch, produce, and procure much more quickly than we did in the past, providing some of the bureaucracy can also be swept away. And while the hulls will endure for many years, how we fight from them and operate around the world will and must continuously adapt for advantage. Now, I have been charged personally by the Prime Minister with becoming the foremost naval power in Europe. I recognize, Pierre, that President Macron has probably said exactly the same to you. So let's make it a friendly competition to mutual benefit rather than a destructive rivalry, which we may have fallen into over the years. But it's not about, and I'm sure Pierre would agree, it's not about tonnage or miles steamed. It's about a mindset. It's about an impact. It's about being bolder. It's about being operationally effective. It's about being globally deployed, persistently present alongside those who matter to us, espousing the values of our nation. Operating at the heart of an integrated force and a leading contributor to deterrent, defense and deterrence of what we hold dear. To achieve that, we'll have to be digitized. We'll have to be data-driven and innovative. We'll have to focus on offensive warfighting capabilities, and we have to maximize our interoperability and interchangeability with our closest allies. We need to be modular, we need to be autonomous, we need to be agile. But we will only achieve all of that if at our heart we are people-oriented. We must attract, train, and retain the very best of the talent available to us across our diverse and wonderful nation. We have to make sure that anyone who comes to work brings with them all of themselves without fear, confronts no prejudice, and feels valued and recognized for the contribution they make. Because for all of the debate about autonomous, for all of the debate about high tech, what we are fundamentally is a people organization, because it is in the minds of people that outcomes are made. And finally, the IR made the point that many problems need a cross-government whole force solution. I couldn't agree more. You would expect us to say that from the review which sought to bring together defense, foreign policy, security, and development issues, and for these to be in lockstep, not in isolation. Unity of thought and action is really clear, is clearly important if we are to achieve what we need to do. And it's crucial also if we are to maximize the investment being made into us, and which, you never know, we may get more of. And it requires us to think in a whole force way, not just within the service, but out with. As I said in Rosyth, I can only achieve what I want to do if I am in lockstep with those who support us. And your success is my success as well. So we are part of the fabric of the nation, and I'm delighted, therefore, that so many of you here today come from our industrial and academic partners, because we are not alone in what we are striving to do. We can only do that bit that the Royal Navy does if you understand what we want and need, and we understand how you can best help. And in liberating and unlocking that potential, then our ambition can be unbounded. Russia's actions over the last couple of months have given us all, democracies and autocracies, pause for thought. If Putin's aim had been to reinvigorate the NATO alliance, persuade nations to invest properly in defense, unite the world in global condemnation, or most of the world in global condemnation, he's been extraordinarily successful, but I suspect that that was not what he wrote on his op order. What we are seeing right now makes for grim viewing. But this alone does not change the conclusions we have reached. Conclusions which call for unity, harnessing the power of our position at the heart of a global alliance of partnerships, global network of partnerships. And whilst Ukraine is but one example of how the world is evolving, we must continue to pay attention to the rest of the world and the lessons that other nations draw from Putin's actions. For the maritime, we need to be clear that some long-established truths are confirmed by what is happening today. Corbett and Mann are worth rereading, that's for the First Sea Lord Fellows, and other more recent assertions based upon perhaps narrow or ill-informed review need setting aside. We are not good at forecasting the future. The trick for practitioners of sea power is to offer choice, both in what we can do and where, such that our government and our ministerial leaders can make the decisions for the best of the nation. And when we are offering that choice, clearly articulated, with risk carefully balanced, that sets us at our best. We have an ability to support prosperity, peace, and security. We can work with the other instruments of power to deliver trade, aid, and diplomacy. We can flex from delivering aid to warfighting almost in a heartbeat, and we can do so alongside others without the permissions of third parties. We can take partnerships from ashore and transfer those bonds to working together at sea. These are exciting times for those of us in the maritime community. And for those of us in the Royal Navy, huge ambition has been set for us, which I welcome. I'm heartened by the strength of everything that I see, and I know that there are huge challenges ahead for the service I have the honor to lead. But working alongside all of you, whether international friends, commercial and industrial partners, or those who would wish us well, I'm confident we can achieve what has been set before us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister and First Sea Lord. We've had two gripping and inspiring sets of remarks. I'd like to, in 60 seconds or so, open the floor up to questions. Remind the few hundred people that are online that they can also put up their so-called blue hand to seek my attention, and I'll try to call on you. I'm reminded by Nick Childs, our Senior Fellow for Naval Affairs, who was the real architect of this event with the First Sea Lord's team, that this week we have published a strategic assessment of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. I might start with the first question, first to you, Minister, and no doubt the First Sea Lord will also have a view on this, about the way in which we partner with other maritime nations, at least in the big three strategic theaters of action, the Mediterranean, the various Gulf choke points that you talked about, Minister, and the Indo-Pacific. I do remember 4 or 5 years ago when I chaired the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, and the then Minister of the Armed Forces, Florence Patley, came, perhaps with the Admiral as well, when she confirmed her attendance at the Shangri-La Dialogue. She said, I will also be coming with a boat. And it was, of course, a Charles de Gaulle that pitched up at Changi Naval Airport, which was quite a lot of signaling to be doing in front of some 28 Indo-Pacific ministers of defense, including General Wei Feng-he, the State Councilor Minister of Defense of China. And since then, of course, the Queen Elizabeth has made its way also to Changi Naval Airport. But Western navies, if one takes out of the calculation the United States Navy, don't have the opportunity to have a fully deployed presence in all these theaters. So it's very much a question of rotational, persistent presence that needs to be coordinated with our major maritime friends. And I wonder, Minister, whether you could address the way in which that can be organized in a way that ensures that a Western strategic voice is in those three strategic theaters as often as possible.
I'd love to. You've just invited me to have exactly the sort of conversation that Charlie and Andrew absolutely hate ministers having, because I get lots of trouble when I tell ships companies they're going to one place and then Charlie finds out and sends somewhere else. So look, I think in the Euro-Atlantic there is a there's a contribution we must make to NATO standing groups, and that should be the foundation of our effort in our near abroad. Then there are things that we will do episodically with other like-minded countries, because not all activity will be NATO flagged. And there's opportunities to do stuff through the CJEF with the French, through the JEF with our beer drinking partners in the north of Europe, or bilaterally with the US, or in combinations thereof. So, some of the deployments into the Barents last year were not NATO. They were sort of people that came together for the purpose of doing that. And so, look, that's the kind of bread and butter, and the first bits of the team sheet we populate, I think, are those commitments to our NATO obligations and our defence and security in the Euro-Atlantic. Thereafter, I think there's two things I would draw out. The first is, I am, having seen an all-white ensign, brilliant that we were joined by the Everson and the Sullivans, but last year there was the Navy said they wanted to send 2 white ensign frigates, 2 white ensign destroyers, Royal Fleet auxiliary support ships, and a white ensign sub, to prove that the UK could do a sovereign carrier strike group, but that normally going forward thereafter, you wouldn't need to have everything, all UK escorts, all UK submarine, all UK support ships. And I think, therefore, we should set ourselves, now we've done CSG 21, to not do the spectacular every 3 or 4 years. I would quite like to see some of the escorts offset, so that there is a presence, maybe alongside the CDG or alongside a US carrier in the Far East always. And likewise, when our carriers do go down into that neck of the woods, other countries come in to support us. Because I think, frankly, the Aussies and the Japanese and the Kiwis have got every right to say we're taking the mick if we turn up with a band every kind of 3, 4, 5 years and say, aren't we brilliant, here we are, rather than actually doing persistent burden sharing in the region alongside the US, the French, and the countries that are in the region. So I quite want to, having done CSG 21, I want to see further long-range carrier deployments, because I think that they are a really important contribution to global security. But I also want to see escorts offset to contribute to French and American carrier groups when they're in the region. And then beyond that, in the sort of, in the Gulf, off the coast of the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, we should look at what happened in Barbados as a warning that you do not take your long-standing friendships in the Commonwealth for granted. And that requires a different profile again, for which Type 31 is brilliantly suited, but so too the Batch 2 OPV. So I think that there is, what I love about the Navy is there's a Navy that's emerging that is a kind of an operate Navy, and that has a war fighting role, but then there's the kind of Type 26, Type 45, astute carrier sort of bit of the Navy that is really relevant within the first and second island chains in the South, in the Pacific, and obviously within our near abroad in the Euro-Atlantic and the seas there. So I've just deployed the entire fleet constantly, but go figure, Charlie.
I think the only thing I would add to what the minister has said there is the need that we have to be constantly practicing and rehearsing with our allies and partners to operate together. So the very point you make about interchangeability, and I know Amiral Pierre agrees with me. He's just recently invited us to send an escort into the next Charles de Gaulle deployment at the back end of the year. It's a critical part of demonstrating coherent, high-end capability by persistently investing and rehearsing it. It also has a fundamental part in demonstrating against the Chinese concept of coupling and decoupling that we are tightly coupled. This is a real paradox that they have to deal with, which is and was seen so powerfully for us in last year in the South China Sea, where Commodore Steve Morehouse on the southbound leg was contending with a strike group of a rainbow coalition of nations were sending ships to join for that passage. And it was a massively important part of what we were what we were trying to do to show international partnerships, alliances, and capability docked together. So when you talk about persistently deployed further forward, burden sharing, I think, is missing the point. It can look like burden sharing, and at times, against specific tasks, that is a very necessary part of what we do. And that, support to Tonga would be a good example of that in one way. But actually, we do this for a much more profound, principled reason, which is, and is a characteristic of the maritime that we must exploit, which is it is easy for us to get together at sea and do things. And in doing so, we constantly rehearse and reinvest in that crucial interchangeability, interoperability that will demonstrate warfighting capability of the highest order. And therefore, that mutual support also achieves operational advantage.
Wonderful. And our first question from the floor is from another ex-soldier who's a fan of the Navy, Tobias Elwood, chair of the Defence Committee in the House of Commons. Right, yeah.
John,
there you go, Tobias.
John, thanks very much indeed. You talked about a systemic change of power. Could I ask whether you look at the Ukrainian in the Russian invasion of Ukraine as perhaps an engagement similar to what Russia did in Chechnya or Afghanistan? Or would you agree with me that there's something much bigger at play? This is perhaps the opening chapter in a new era of insecurity, perhaps the first step in the Thucydides trap of a power change, axis of Russia and China, as our international rules-based order increasingly erodes. I don't know anybody that thinks the next 10 years is going to get more safer. I think most people think it's going to get more dangerous. If you agree with any of that, is it now time to have a bigger Navy?
Who would like to take that first, Minister?
Well, I know Ben's answer. So, Tobias, I mean, I think you're right that this is a there are a number of outcomes that could come from what's going on in Ukraine. And I saw that Ben in Finland yesterday used an analogy that he's used a number of times with us in our sort of strategy meetings, where there's the Vietnam situation where Russia just completely capitulates and the wheels come off, and Ukraine is completely successful. Or there's the frozen conflict Korea outcome where it grinds itself to a halt at some point, 5 months or 5 years away, freezes, and then there's tension that lasts thereafter. But actually, and in the latter, very obviously, you see a sustained period of instability that follows. But even in the former, it shouldn't be taken as read that in the event of capitulation or complete Ukrainian success, it shouldn't be taken as granted that that leads to a Russia that is no longer belligerent within the Euro-Atlantic, because that may be the case if they've been written down to the point that they can't be. But it may be that a vindictive Russia seeks to be even more belligerent, and so we have to be. So I think we have to prepare ourselves that most routes lead to a sustained period of greater instability in the Euro-Atlantic. Now the challenge is, and you know you do this in the House of Commons, you've been challenging over the size of the army, and now today we're challenging over the size of the Navy. And there are, I mean, there are choices inevitably that have to be made. My sense is that the IR already, with the announcement of Type 32, has committed to the fleet growing for the first time in a long time. And I'm very, very, and almost before, ahead of more destroyers and frigates, I see the sort of the MROS and the sort of subsurface, protecting our infrastructure, challenging the subsurface infrastructure of others as higher priorities than that. But you know, they're all on the First Sea Lord shopping list. I think that there's a moment of reckoning coming where the Euro-Atlantic security situation requires all NATO countries, the UK included, to consider what our response is. And within that response, there's clearly an argument that more hard power is likely to be necessary. and we'll see exactly how that pans out over the next few months or so.
First Sea Lord.
Of course, I'd like a bigger Navy. It's not something we can switch on immediately, sadly. We can't just go and purchase it. And what I would really like to see, so the first thing I would like to see, and I think we're seeing it, but it's a confidence for long-term investment, is a bigger maritime enterprise across the United Kingdom. Actually, if we set ourselves so that our supply chains, our shipbuilding industry, our capability investments are all scaled for a bigger Navy, then in due course we will achieve it. And the first step that advocacy really matters is that instead of something that feels just enough, just in time, and dare I say it, the product of many years of a shrinking Navy, thereby being rationalized for ever greater efficiency and effectiveness sometimes taken at risk, is to reverse that paradigm. So one of the things I struggle with at the moment is that in the triad of performance, cost, and time, time is the trade space. Actually, time of delivery, certainty that things will happen when we say they're going to happen, is the most important thing that we now need in order to be able to respond at speed to what is going on. And I don't think we got an argument too strongly that we can trade our performance. So that leads us now into variability around cost. And we just have to accept that if we want to achieve everything we're going to do, and I wouldn't be surprised saying this, then the welcome opportunities that seem to be emerging about that broader debate as to whether or not enough money has been spent on defence. And I don't, that's for the government to determine. But the responsiveness I want in the system, if that is the answer, is actually a maritime enterprise that is suitably scaled for growth moving forward, not just a bigger Navy as of today, because we can't produce that. It takes 7 to 10 years to grow a Cat A nuclear watchkeeper for a submarine, let alone 14 years to build one. So we've got a kind of a debate going on at the moment about what it is we switch on. And whilst I welcome the minister's point about there's some stuff that we could build very quickly, much more cheaply, we recognize the roles it's got in the patrol boats, all of that's great opportunity. We can only do that out of a UK maritime enterprise that is scaled for ambition. And I think we're getting there, but I wouldn't half mind if we got there quicker.
Thank you. There was another question here. Yes, if you could stand up, the microphone will migrate.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan Beale from BBC.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the Minister, first of all, I think you raised the question, why are Royal Navy ships so big? And then you answered that you're ordering just the right ones. So I wondered why you asked that question. I think it was followed by the point about lethality. And we all know Royal Navy ships are often fitted for, but not with. So would you really like to see smaller ships fitted armed to the teeth, essentially? And then if I could ask Admiral Key, you say the IR remains valid, even though it was done before the war in Ukraine. Are you saying there are no lessons to be learnt from what's going on in Ukraine? Thank you.
Minister first.
So, Jonathan, I think my hypothesis was if missile technology is in the ascendancy and the maxim on land, sea, and air is hide to survive, if you found, you're dead, why would we build ever bigger ships? But then there's also a premium if hide to survive, if you found, you're dead. The other part of that equation is you've got to find people. And as it was explained to me, there's a sort of trade-off, because if you need sensors that have got real reach and can find people at greater range and give you the advantage, that requires elevation. And so I can't, I've just exhausted it. I'm impressed how much naval architecture I now know, but that is literally its limits. And so it's not quite as straightforward as just turning around and saying, right, what we need is just like tiny things with everyone's got a cruise missile on it and they all just disperse and do their thing. Maybe you can see a scenario within which there are lots of those, and I see a theme developing across all three conventional domains, that the kind of platform that looks very much like what we've got now is increasingly augmented by stuff around it that creates the problem set. And I think you get to a place where you can have, and maybe in time you get to a place where you don't need all the sensors on the platform. You can have dispersed sensors and algorithms that help to bring all those dispersed sensors to give you a single battle picture. And I'm agnostic. I'm quite happy that if, for as long as the Navy says that a 7,000-ton destroyer is what it needs, then they have a 7,000-ton destroyer. But if they turn around and say, actually, what we need is 50 500-ton autonomous platforms, that's fine by me too. I've never had this great sort of like, there must be X number of frigates and X number of destroyers, because that's being a slave to the metrics of hard power that did exist, and they may not be the metric for the future. So I'm ready to take guidance from those who know their domain best on what the best way to project maritime power is, providing I don't think that people are being misty-eyed and kind of, indulging a passion for what went before, when there might be an opportunity to do things differently in the future. And to your point about lethality, I absolutely think that, if the purpose of operating is to reassure your allies by your presence and to cause your adversaries a dilemma, you kind of have to operate with something that causes them a dilemma. And that I think means that we do need to reconsider whether a whole number is meaningful, or is it actually the lethality of the hulls that you've got. And I just so I would, to Tobias's point about, do we need a bigger Navy? Maybe, but only once we've armed the one we've got to the degree that I want a Royal Navy warship to be the most feared on the seas. That should be the sort of starting point, and then see what comes thereafter.
First Sea Lord.
Jonathan, thank you. Of course, there are lessons to be learned. My piece, which I clearly didn't get across as clearly as, I think the underlying principles of the IR are still absolutely valid. But what we've seen play out in the last few months, both actually in the latter part of last year through events in the Middle East, and I would argue, and also this year now in the Euro-Atlantic, is that some of our underlying assumptions are not correct. We are seeing a rate of use of weapon stockpiles, which probably are outside anything that had been planned or expected as part of the Defence Ukraine. We saw last year in the way that Kabul gave way very fast at a point that was not predicted, that some of our intelligence analysis could be misinterpreted as giving certainty where certainty did not exist. And so it is about the resilience and adaptability of our system in its broadest sense that I think a number of our lessons will be learned. And I go back to my point about a maritime enterprise. If you make some assumptions that a maritime enterprise can spool up quickly to meet a new demand, then best you've told the maritime enterprise that that's what you require of them, and that they've done some work and told you what that implication is. So I think some of the lessons that we're seeing played out at the moment are state on state is brutal and loss is inevitable. I think we're seeing that things these days will move at a speed that is going to be very uncomfortable for the kind of traditional defense planning assumptions. And so we need to think quite clearly about what's the premium we're prepared to pay in order to invest back into that agility. And the third piece that I think is that you need, in recognizing flexible choice as being offered to government, there are some underlying truths about the nature of preparedness and how we practice that and rehearse that it is only at the blink of an eyelid you can be found out if you're not in the right place. And I think those things are really quite profound for the way we go about our business, because some of the comfort we've taken from 40 years of having not lost a ship in combat, to give but one example, are probably now to be false comforts.
Well, many thanks. I think the statements of the Minister of the Armed Forces and the First Sea Lord and the initial comments from the floor very well set the context for today's deliberations. I want to thank in particular the Minister of the Armed Forces for his spirited and command of detail address. I can confirm that he had a very busy morning already on an important and pressing subject of the day, and it was really impressive that he was able to come and deliver this expose on his concept for the Royal Navy of the future. And First Sea Lord, it was again a signal honor for the IISS for you to speak here at your first Sea Lords conference. We invite everybody here for a brief coffee break and to return in 10 minutes for the first plenary. Thank you very much to both our speakers.